Well, hi, folks. First things first, I'll thank Kathy and Christina for inviting me to give this talk. As Kathy was saying a second ago there, the last couple of years, I've sort of drifted away from this stuff, my theory stuff and approaches to socialization and things, and I've been working on accessibility and demographics and stuff. But really, it comes from the same kind of place, right? I basically was interested in ancient socialization and socializing processes. And then through that and through developing theory for that, I kind of got interested in the socialization of the people who are interpreting the past, right? So it actually all comes from the same kind of place. So anyway, it was nice to be invited to do this, and it got me back into thinking some of that stuff. So it's given me a bit of oomph that I probably could have done with to get on with a couple of publications I had in mind. Now, usually when I'm looking at socialization in the deep past, I've been thinking about the role of landscapes and places, usually religious spaces. But in the interest of it being an art historical series and approaches to images and stuff, I'm going to use a case study looking at Iron Age figurines from Judah, which are something else I've not gone back to in a while. So I hope that fits the audience a bit more than people wandering through mountains and looking at birds and stuff that I usually think about. So here we go. I want to open with this Foucault quote when he was wondering if one day people might think of the 20th century as being named for Deleuze. It's not. But my broad goal today is to convince some people that maybe the 21st should be, at least in archaeology. Now, there is an awful lot of obfuscating language when people are talking about relational ontologies as frameworks for looking at the past, and quite a lot used around socialization. So I want to try and do a bit of an overview first about socialization in archaeology before I get wired into how I approach these themes and crack into ancient examples. The most dominant approaches to socialization in archaeology are usually borrowed from sociologists. I'm usually from these guys. And both Giddens and Bourdieu's approaches to socialization can, I think, be split pretty conveniently into two broad forms of socialization. For convenience, I'm calling them top level and bottom level. Top level is the more readily observable stuff, and usually what most people would think of if somebody says socialization, right? It's how we learn and reproduce social cultural norms and things. So most sociological theory kind of subdivides that into two sets of phenomena, one about learning individual identities and roles, and one about transferring cultural values and things through generations to children. So in the first case, we learn gender roles, parental roles, spousal roles, employer, employee, pupil, teacher, and so on. And we learn how to inhabit and perform these. And in the second case, we learn our particular society's customs, values, taboos, and things like that. And we reproduce them by exposing subsequent generations to them. Giddens calls the mechanism for this structuration. This is people interact with structures that shape society, and that they reflect on these and they become embedded through time. Thereafter that, people sort of act and behave and think in accordance with these, and that recreates the conditions that encourage them, and you get this cycle. Bourdieu, meanwhile, talks about habitus, which is again the process of engagement with social norms. And this is culturally constituted dispositions formed through practice, serve to encourage and validate and maintain individual and collective behavior, right? It's similar to Giddens. It's a reflexive process. You're simultaneously building these things and practicing them, and they constrain what you do at the same time. So it's a sort of cycle. Now, both of these phenomena are thoroughly investigated by archaeologists. We see both theories referenced directly quite often. Indeed, these phenomena have been the nuts and bolts of archaeology, really, since before it was archaeology. Antiquarians were already clumping together assemblages as archaeological cultures based on artifacts, buildings, other material culture, that, you know, this similar stuff represents the norms and behaviors of one society, and this other stuff represents another one. I'm trying to trace these through time and observe stasis and change in them and things, right? So modern interpreters generally recognize it's a bit more complex than antiquarians of the early 19th century did, but the bones of the broad interpretational process were kind of there. As such, we're very well practiced at it. There's loads of archaeological literature on this kind of stuff because the discipline's good at investigating evidence of these things. So there are a couple of overviews there of archaeologies of identity, how people express their personhood, their identity, their place in society, and of archaeologies of memory, how cultural values, norms, beliefs are transferred through time. You can trace that through, material culture typologies of whatever. Archaeological motifs of preserving traditions. So this stuff is what I'm calling top-level socialization. Archaeology is good at it. What I describe as bottom-level socialization is the underlying ontologies which all this other stuff is built on. So it's the fundamental assumptions and beliefs about what the world is, what people are, the identities that can be acquired, the persons that you can be, the values that underlie these things and that it is appropriate to think. Things you believe can exist rather than what you can acquire for yourself. So you have to be able to conceptualize something before you can learn to perform it, right? The assumption that women are innately better caregivers, for an easy example, that underlies lots of gender roles, labor relations and things. Again, both Bourdieu and Giddens have specific theories about this. Bourdieu calls it doxa, thinks of it as basic assumptions about the world. Giddens calls it practical consciousness. It frames and constrains the perceptions and actions of everyday life. Slightly different emphases, but the same sort of concept, right? Obvious, undeniable, maybe difficult to express ideas about the world, but ones that shape how you perceive and engage with and interact with life, the world, other people. Summed up pretty well here by this Harris and Rob quote. For the rest of today then, this is what I'm thinking of when I say socialization. I mean these basic understandings about the world. Not just about learning how you're meant to dress depending on your gender roles or appropriate language to use and to be polite or whatever. I'm interested in the stuff that is built on top of. Now, it's important to be aware that Bourdieu and Giddens are or were interested in developing theories of socialization for understanding extant communities with stable social conditions. Their research addressed people and phenomena they could observe firsthand, living their lives, raising their kids, and so on. Giddens was explicitly interested in models of modern capitalist societies. Bourdieu was working in an anthropological context, but again, with communities he could go and watch and speak to and ask questions. And if you work with people you can engage with firsthand, the stuff is still maybe tricky to access. People might struggle to articulate it, but you can go and ask people what they think about the world. You can query the things they think are absurd or think are obvious. You can confirm or deny your observations. Obviously, these things are difficult for archaeologists, and there are extra stumbling blocks. Their theories make no effort to deal with the appearance of new societies or major shifts in society, simply not what they're investigating. And although they do deal with material culture, they're not trying to develop theories that are reliant on it. But these things are fundamental to archaeological pursuits, right? We're very often dealing with long periods of time where lots of change happens and we have no witnesses to interrogate. So the result for archaeologists trying to deal with this kind of stuff is that we have a theoretical corpus that can struggle to build a clear bridge from material data to the reconstructions of society we're trying to make and get this data theory gap. So that's the fundamental problem I'm trying to wrestle with when I'm working on socialization issues. Bridging that gap between the data we have access to as archaeologists and the theories that we then try to apply to it. Okay. So a constant there is that socialization is developed through experience. It's our experience of the world. We internalize that, and those experiences come to frame, inform, develop how we understand other experiences or how we process other experiences. So if archaeologists are to overcome this data theory gap, we require robust approaches to experience that can allow us to extrapolate socialization process from archaeologically identifiable material. Archaeologists have employed a few approaches to this. These are probably the most common, especially the first one. I have a couple of problems with phenomenology and evolutionary psychology as approaches to socialization. I'm not going to dive into that in detail in the interest of time, but happy to talk about it in the discussion if folks are interested. Fundamentally, they're most often used to think about places and landscapes anyway, and they can be difficult to apply to specific objects, art, images, these kind of things. So we'll dive straight into relational ontologies. A few regularly cited texts here. You see a lot in the literature, +1 on the far right. That's a good overview and discussion of key themes and trends in applications of relational frameworks. Relational ontologies largely emerge in archaeology from post-humanist discourse that was trying to break down human material dualities and separations, right? Approaches and theories that sought to downplay the centrality of human action in interpretations of the past and give more credit to how environments, materials, objects, built structures, non-human animals all contribute to society in and of themselves and not purely as things over which humans exercise agency. It's part of a wider material turn of the humanities in the 90s. So a variety of theoretical paradigms emerged from this in archaeology, most prominently materiality and new materialism, and then more recently Deleuzian theory, which I'll concentrate on in a second. Again, not going to look at materiality and new materialism specifically, but I'm happy to chat, keen to chat at length about them if people want later on. Basically, I think they're good for raising questions, but I'm not convinced they give us solid methodologies to do this data theory bridging thing that I'm interested in. Okay, so relational ontologies, they tend to stress a few things. Assemblages, which are combinations of materials and their non-material components as they're experienced in an instant. So importantly, the fundamental component of an assemblage isn't its material or non-material parts. It's the and, okay, the in-betweenness of components, right? When you experience objects, you experience the material and that material and these associations you have with that material, right? And. So it's not a collection of things that have relations, it actually is the relations between them. Second, relational ontologies see experience as emergent from those relations. We experience objects, places, things from the relations. So when I interact with a given object, I experience an assemblage of relations of which that object is part. I don't just experience the object, the thing I'm looking at, the image. And third, these are constantly changing. They're fluid, they are constantly becoming something else, becoming something else, becoming something else. We can't experience an assemblage twice because our previous experience inform it, okay? Very quick example to hang that on. That's a watch I used to wear. It's part of an assemblage of sensory, material, and sociocultural components, right? It has weight, you can feel it on your wrist, it ticks and you hear it. It has certain aesthetic qualities, it's made of metals and glass, there's branding, different types of watches have certain connotations or associations with value or with prestige or with functionality or whatever. There's even associations with time, concepts of times, organization of time. And there are also memories and things attached to it. It was a birthday present, right? I changed the strap on it. I no longer have it because my son played with it one morning and it disappeared into the ether. So the experience of the watch, every time I look now, if I look at pictures of that watch and when I used to see it on my wrist, I'm experiencing all these different things at once, right? And the relationship between them. Now, the experiences that emerge from engaging with a watch then are constituted by these relations between the different components. The context, both on my arm, the surroundings, tactile stuff, memories, attitudes to jewelry, all this stuff, right? We don't just look at it and see watch, we see all the things that are happening, right? I don't just find out the time, there's an experience of a load of stuff happening at once. So that's the key parts of relational ontologies then, right? I think this pretty satisfyingly explains how we experience things, what an experience is, right? It's a bunch of stuff happening at once. But it still doesn't really give us a method to apply to things. I need to be able to articulate all these things in order for somebody to understand my experience of a watch. It also focuses on a single moment, right? The emergence of the experience in a moment, single instances of experience. But we aren't socialized in an instant. It's repeated experiences, things that we engage with over and over and over and over and over again in different ways and in different places, in different contexts. That's what makes us learn about the world. It comes to frame what we think the world is. Okay. Oh, no. So, right. So far, top level socialization, personal identities, intergenerational transfer of norms, they're fairly well addressed in archaeology. The fundamental underlying understandings are less so. That these understandings are developed through experience of the world and engagement with the world and repeated engagements with the world. And that we have interesting theories about singular experiences, but no sort of obvious, clear methodology to address them or their accumulation. So to try and do that, I'm going to borrow from ideas mostly presented in co-authored works from the philosopher Gilles Deleuze and the psychoanalyst Félix Guattari. Now, assemblage thinking is is largely derived from then, the concept of the assemblage. But usually it's made its way to archaeology via other people drawing upon them, usually Manuel, DeLanda, Bruno Latour, or Jane Bennett. Usually, when presented in archaeological contexts, it's these people you see cited and not the originators, though that's changing. And often I think it gets a bit detached from other concepts they use to understand society, which can help us to overcome these issues a lot. Especially to think about the accumulation of experience. So there are three ideas here, in addition to the assemblage, that I want to use from them: folds, rhizomes, plateaus. Fold is just the name Deleuze gives to the internalization of experience. You fold in experiences of assemblages, and this changes you in some way. Every time you engage with something, you fold that experience in. So that's pretty straightforward. Rhizomes are a little more involved. They present this as the total lattice of relations, right? The connections between all things. So all associations we have with stuff, with all the materials, all the interactions with other people, everything, right? Every fold, every little experience is a node in this, and the relations between them all are what they call rhizome. It's constantly expanding. It connects everything, every experience. And everything in it, every node in that influences all the other ones. My folded experience of the watch of one assemblage will inform future ones, but it also informs how I remember those of my past. Losing my watch changes how I remember it, and informs my experiences of other ones. I think rhizomes make for a pretty usable archaeological tool. We can identify experiences in the archaeological record and build up a rhizome of experiences in that society. And then we have anchors to think about socialization processes. Right? These movements of assemblages that socializing experiences emerge from. The more we know about folded experiences of things, the more we can say about other things. That said, archaeology is a big data discipline as it is, and lattices of every folded experience is ludicrous and wildly beyond computation. So we can employ our third concept, which is plateaus. And plateaus, they present as groups of distinguishable, albeit fluid, planes that organize experiential processes within the rhizome. They make concrete nests of connected experiences at the moment of emergence. So they allow us to group, for instance, every folded experience that the individual has with a given concept. So in practice, for me, best understood as social conditions built up by the millions of folded experiences lying within them. But they're not fixed, they're not confined. Things aren't confined to a single plateau. They're also emergent, and they appear, they fade, they separate and coalesce, right? They're sort of kaleidoscopic. So you have lots of different experiences of things, and at a particular point, something is visible, something is concrete. So they're quite useful analytical tools rather than fixed categories. You can kind of adjust them. You can group them as you see fit for your particular interpretative process, your particular investigation. Okay, so I'm getting towards something of a method I think we can actually apply to archaeological material. I start with an archaeological datum or a data set, right? Is this initial assemblage? So it could be something obvious, could be an individual artifact, which is what I will do today. It could be a particular space. This could be the entire case study, or it might be something fairly arbitrary that's just selected as a starting point, right? So I might pick a religious structure in a study of cult spaces more generally. I then identify plateaus that informed emergent experiences of that assemblage. So I'm looking at a watch. That might be other experiences of the metals involved, of jewelry, of time. Or if I'm looking at this cult space, it might be of religious texts, cosmology, divine motifs in art. Okay. After that, we can reconstruct the underlying assumptions that contributed to the assemblage by fleshing out those other plateaus, right? We can seek out related assemblages that we can confidently connect to the same individuals. So, for example, necklaces or pins found in association with a watch that let me think about other experiences of jewelry. As I said, ritual texts, other religious spaces, religious iconography and artifacts and cult wares, right, that might help me understand people's experiences of religious spaces. And then we can consider the individual's experience of that initial assemblage again in light of those plateaus, querying how cosmological narratives contributed to somebody's experience of a religious space. And then lastly, we can draw conclusions about the actual socializing impact of that. What does that mean? If you're exposed to a space that makes you think of all these other things that you experience because of all these other things, what does that mean for how you understand the world and how over time that accumulates? Right, so there you go. That's how I kind of try and depict these rhizomes to make it clear in my head when I'm doing this as an interpretative thing. You've got your watch as the key component of this assemblage I experience, plateaus of folded experiences that might inform how I engage with that, right? Things about gendered fashion and jewelry and branding and value, organization of time, all these sorts of things. Okay. Enough theory and watches. Let's do an ancient one. So I'm going to look at a group of figurines from Iron Age Judah. For some speedy context, Judah is the southernmost of the two kingdoms usually grouped as ancient Israel. The kingdom of Israel lies immediately to its north. Its other immediate neighbors are a number of pretty small polities or groups of city-states, many of which become Assyrian vassals through this period. And indeed, Judah regularly finds itself under threat from Mesopotamian empires, first Assyria and later Babylon, and is eventually conquered in the 6th century BC by Babylon. That's the start of what is traditionally described as the exile. There are two very common types of Judean pillar figurines, those with molded heads, as on the right here, with their almond-shaped eyes and rings of sort of braided hair or wigs, and those with far less detailed handmade pinched faces, as on the left. The lower half is always handmade on both examples, both hold or support their breasts, and there is never any anatomy depicted lower than the arms and breasts. The shaft is always plain. They're pretty roughly made. They're not very robust. They're usually from identifiably local clays where petrographic analysis has been carried out. They were extremely abundant in Judahite settlements from the 8th to 6th centuries, especially 7th, 6th centuries, particularly in domestic contexts. So they were interacted with on some level by a substantial demographic, if not the entire populace, and they provide an avenue then down which to consider society-wide experiences. And many hundreds of them have been found even just in Jerusalem alone, but they're ubiquitous in Judahite settlements of the period. They're a decent test case because of that ubiquity, but also because we can reconstruct quite a lot of our socio-cultural components of assemblages, given the vast amount of data and the enormous history of research into social life of the Iron Age of the Southern Levant. So, as I said, they were familiar to most, if not all of society, but I'm interested, for the purposes of today, in the socializing experiences of children, young girls, really. Most of them are located in and around domestic structures, where at least younger children can be expected to have spent a lot of their time. Children's play objects, which I'll argue at least some of these can be labelled, play a key role in communicating and encouraging the practicing of adult behaviours. And routinized activities, such as might be performed day to day in the home whilst children were present and playing or watching, seeing these things, frame and direct experiential interactions with the world, and so are fundamental to social reproduction and to the learning of understandings of the world. Okay, so to draw out these socioeconomic components of assemblages, we could start with the function of these figurines. They're generally interpreted as cultic artifacts. They're most often associated with the goddess Ashera, or with popular women's or domestic religion, very often connected to fertility. Very occasionally, they've been interpreted as toys. A cultic use seems likely. Some originate in sacred public spaces, others from cult assemblages in domestic contexts. And a group of figurines appears with other cultic wares in a Jerusalem cave. The excavator Kenyon believed it to be a cult centre, although there's debate about that. Explicitly associating them with Asherah is less convincing. This interpretation really rests on their being understood to be goddesses, and the goddess best evidenced as a recipient of worship in Judah in this period is Asherah. This is an illustration of a pithoi from Kuntula Ajrud, which depicts male and female figures together, and the inscription describes Yahweh and his Asherah, so the state god of Judah and his wife or consort. Alternatively, some others, probably most prominently Erin Darby, has suggested that rather than Asherah or another senior deity, they might be divine interlocutors, either sort of lowly divinities or human mediators. That also seems like a fair hypothesis to me, but the absence of any indicative markings or inscriptions of any kind on any pillar figurines makes a confident identification impossible. The common perception that they held fertility meanings and were particularly of interest to women, again, seems fairly reasonable to me, despite the somewhat simplistic breasts, therefore female, therefore fertility goddess thought process that sometimes leads to that. There is contemporary Eastern Mediterranean pillar figurines, which include sort of groups with women actually nursing children. So this is one from Cyprus. Well, two figurines from Cyprus, one that's very similar, and then one nursing the baby. The explicit depiction of breasts, where even the faces of many of the pinched faces ones are just a tiny suggestion of anatomy, does make them a pretty hard to miss detail. They're certainly the focus of many of the figurines. Even if they were not intended to represent fertility, I think a Deleuzian framework encourages us to observe that any experience of the figurine is innately an experience of all its components, which include these breasts and their associations. Fertility is, of course, not exclusively a concern of women, but childbirth was a central part, it's really stressed in text as a central part of women's identity and a core responsibility in marriage. In ancient West Asian literature, the Hebrew Bible presents infertility as a devastating and really shameful condition for women. And okay, and then finally, some mid-20th century excavation reports categorize the pillar figurines as toys. A handful of more recent works have also sort of flown the same flag. That interpretation is often rejected on account of their presence in public buildings, their crudeness, fragility, lack of evidence of them being smoothed through lots of use. But I would suggest we shouldn't discount objects from use as toys simply because they weren't intended as toys. Whether or not they were the people making them intended these to be toys doesn't seem unreasonable to me to suggest that they may well have been played with pretty regularly. Kids will play with basically anything, right? Small objects that are or can be made to represent humanoid figures certainly lend themselves to it. I don't think having a cultic role or being placed in cultic spaces necessarily prevents that either. I used to play with my grandma's nativities all the time. So if we accept that these figurines were cult objects, possibly depicting a divine figure, interacted with frequently by children in domestic contexts, we can start to think about the sociocultural components of the assemblage, right, of the pillar figurine as an assemblage. The active role of place in experience is a frequent motif of the literature. So let's start with the immediate context that these children would have spent a lot of time in and around. Here is a typical house in Gezer. This type of house, usually called a four-room or pillared house, in which many of these figurines have been found, dominates the Iron Age southern Levant. And it's named for its four main spaces you see here. Sometimes they're subdivided, but the style of house revolves around these four fundamental sort of building blocks. There are some examples outside of Israel and Judah in the earlier Iron Age, but by the time Judean pillar figurines are common, they're really restricted to just those two kingdoms. And they're characteristic of these two communities. Their association and territoriality is so strong, in fact, that they're quite often presented as a manifestation of Israelite and Judahite ontology and identity. They're this very simple, consistent, accessible layout, sometimes seem to embody an egalitarian worldview that some scholars also believe is observable in biblical texts. So maybe the architectural structure of the house itself presents some plateaus of experience concerning an egalitarian ontology, but the practices that took place within it are more readily identifiable. Several obvious plateaus of groups of experiences can be immediately discerned, right? You'll have experiences of family, of meal preparation, for instance, at least some forms of the latter being a specifically feminine activity and therefore presenting folded experiences of gendered behaviors, or gendered possibility behaviors. Consequently, domestic experiences of these figurines are folded in along with experiences of family life, what family is, how men and women fit into the world, how parents, children fit in. Other archaeologically identifiable domestic processes in houses, such as, say, textile production, also present related plateaus, perhaps providing the background to some of children's play experiences. This is a house from Tel Halif. That row of stones in the purple room, the horizontal row in the purple room, are all loom weights. And there was a warp-weighted loom situated in this room. So textile production presents a really interesting plateau of girls' childhood experiences. It's overwhelmingly gendered nature in the ancient world, and the extreme time intensity of it in pre-industrial context mean it's a regular background activity in the home. The dominance of women in textile production and many of its processes being most efficient in groups mean it contextualized lots of women's social experiences and knowledge sharing. As such, it's highly likely that young girls' folded experiences of pillar figurines frequently involved exposure to women's domestic craft production, to women's social networks. Stacks more loom weights in another Tel Halif house marked in red here. Not only did textile production frame many women's interactions, it was also an occupation of desirable women in the Judahite imagination. So the biblical texts characterize something like women of valor. And it presents them as producing, or as the production of textiles being fundamental to the ideal woman. Okay, so such a woman works with wool, flax, and spindles. She clothes her household. She makes fine clothes. She sells linen garments and sashes. She does all these things as a sort of idealized motherly figure. So young girls playing with pillar figurines, or being around these pillar figurines, folding them in, experiencing sort of the embedded basic understandings of what women are meant to be. And finally, textile production itself could represent a religiously loaded experience, and consequently plateaus of cult practice and cult perceptions and understandings and ontologies. Divine patrons of weaving and spinning were commonplace in the ancient East Mediterranean, West Asia. Asherah herself, for whom women did weaving in the Jerusalem temple, according to the Book of Kings, seems to have filled this role in Judah. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence of cultic textile production appears both in Judah at Kantilla Ajrud and on its eastern borders at Deir Allah and Kurub al-Medina. So folded experiences of weaving and spinning were themselves framed by sort of plateaus of cosmology, ritual purpose. The cultic meaningfulness of textile production sits alongside more explicit ritual practice. At least some pillared houses were ritual venues. Hebrew Bible's pretty enthusiastic about communal family worship, and small family shrines are known in a bunch of pillared houses. A few examples here. There are only 2 archaeologically identified cult structures in all of Judah from this period. We can add the Jerusalem temple to that we know existed, but overall, it seems that buildings built specifically for ritual and cult purpose were pretty rare. So the home was likely a very regular theatre of communal family cult practice. Experiences of religious practice, religious spaces framed child's experiences of pillar figurines in the home, right? And it's folded in, therefore, an association with religious localities. Fertility concerns are folded in multiple ways, I think. Firstly, the connotations of the figurine itself, so conceptions of childbirth, productivity, child rearing, are fundamental to the assemblage. Secondly, they're reinforced by the figurine's rhizomatic connections to domestic cult, frequently concerned with fertility, formed through their sharing of the house, this cultic venue. The child's figurine experiences are folded in alongside notions of fertility, lactation, then possibly of their own siblings being nursed by their mothers in the same space, and their future obligations to deliver and raise children, right? Motherhood and womanhood. Another sort of plateau of related experiences is that of Judahite personhood. Not just what Judahite women are or can be, but what Judahites themselves are as a group, as a community, as a people. Pillar figurines are not like pillar figurines, not these specific ones, but other types of pillar figurines aren't uncommon in surrounding territories. But the Judahite corpus is way more homogeneous and far more clearly territorially restricted than any of the sort of comparanda. They also develop alongside Judahite urbanization, and the other major iconographic motifs of the 8th and 7th century Judah, right? Lamelech seals and rosette stamps. So these processes happen simultaneously. Through the same period, Assyria is drawing the Levant under its control, right, from the 8th century, by the end of which Judah too has become a vassal. Judahite prisoners defeated by the Assyrian king Sennacherib on the Lachish relief here. Pointing to the figurines' territoriality in this context, some folks have suggested a close relationship between the figurines, Judah's borders, and national identity. Particularly bolder Ryan Byrne, Ian Wilson, who've suggested that their popularity is a direct response to imperial domination. It's a sort of uprising in national pride or identity marking. Whether or not Judean pillar figurines were a response to external aggression, they can certainly be closely associated with Judah and its population and represent a cultural motif that was not shared by any of its neighbours, and they were therefore a buttress of national character. These girls' folded experiences of them at home, consequently embedded with manifestations of the society they were situated in. So, with some key plateaus informed pillar figurine interactions marked out, we can think about the meaning that emerged from all of their relations, the consequences that has for socializing processes. If we sketch out a rhizome containing or centering on the figurine and its relations with these plateaus, we can consider the meanings that emerge from them and therefore draw out sort of socializing messages immersed in them. The figurine's folded in the context of the home. It's embedded with previous folded plateaus of domestic practice, family, cult experiences, fertility. These elicited other previously folded perceptions, womanhood, and nurturing, national identity, intertwined with folded perceptions of a polity under threat. As such, these concepts become inseparable from the figurine assemblage, right? And the meaning and socializing experience that come from it are contingent on the relationships of these plateaus of experience. Oh, not that one. So clearly the idiosyncratic perceptions of these concepts held by a specific individual 2.5 millennia ago aren't reachable. But I think we can point to broad ideas that on a societal level across many individuals help us understand how social conditions were learnt and reproduced. Girls interacting with pillar figurines in Judah experienced objects that manifested ritual significance, the importance of domestic cult, taught them appropriate perceptions of gender, reinforced what it meant to be Judahite. And these socializing experiential planes are themselves plateaus that overlap and reinforce one another and frame other experiences of different assemblages. And in this way, by examining further artifacts, further recourse to textual material, ethnographic comparanda, the other artifacts, the interpreter can build up an ever-expanding rhizome of social interaction, piece together the complex socializing processes that maintain social conditions and behaviors through time. Like most archaeological research drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, my approach here addresses the material world as experienced as fleeting emergent assemblages of material and non-material components. But unlike most assemblage approaches, what I'm trying to do here, what I think I'm starting to do here, is not address just the moment in which assemblages emerge, but to think about the consequences of experiences over time and of repeated ones. So, yeah, by borrowing extra concepts from Deleuze and Guattari, who are usually the inspiration for these sorts of approaches, plateaus, rhizomes, I think cumulative emergence becomes a bit more accessible, and we can start to think about how the experience of one assemblage informs another. And that, I think, gives us a way of accessing what Bourdieu and Giddens call doxa, practical consciousness, giving us the basis to build other socialization processes on top of, and start to help to build that bridge between data and theory. Okay, thank you very much. That's me for the talking bit.